Sometimes the picture-perfect marriage is just the perfect illusion. My name's Jake Miller, and 6 months ago, I thought I had the perfect life. Senior marketing director at one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the city, married to Sarah Miller, a stunning, ambitious account manager who could light up any room she entered. Our Instagram feed was a masterpiece of curated perfection. Weekend getaways to Napa Valley, candlelit dinners at trendy downtown restaurants, and those effortless couple photos that made our friends comment with heart eye emojis. But perfection, I've learned, is often just an illusion wrapped in designer clothes and filtered lighting. It started with the small things, the kind of details that most husbands would probably miss, but my analytical mind has always been wired to notice patterns. Sarah had always been social, always excited about work events, but there was something different about the way she mentioned this particular company dinner. Her voice had this breathless quality when she talked about it, like she was a teenager discussing her first date. "It's just the quarterly celebration," she'd said, standing in front of our bathroom mirror, applying mascara with unusual precision. "Marcus is organizing it this time. He's got some new creative vision for how these things should go." Marcus Hayes, the name that had started appearing more frequently in her conversations over the past 3 months. The creative director at her firm, young, confident, with the kind of effortless charisma that made clients fall over themselves to approve his campaigns. Sarah always spoke about him with this particular tone, a mix of professional respect and something else I couldn't quite identify at the time. "You know," I had said, adjusting my tie in the mirror behind her, "I don't think I've ever met this Marcus guy, even though you talk about him constantly." Sarah's hand had paused for just a fraction of a second, so brief that anyone else would have missed it, but I caught it. "Oh, you know how it is with work people," she'd laughed, but the sound felt forced. "Different worlds and all that." Different worlds. That phrase had stuck with me because it was so unlike Sarah. She'd always been eager to merge our social circles, always pushing for double dates with her colleagues, always wanting me to attend every company happy hour. But suddenly, Marcus Hayes existed in some separate universe that apparently didn't include husbands. The night of the dinner, I watched her get ready with the kind of attention I usually reserved for market research data. She'd spent 2 hours preparing, not unusual for Sarah, who treated every public appearance like a photo shoot, but there was an energy about her that felt electric. She'd chosen a black dress I'd never seen before, something that hugged her curves in a way that was professional enough for work, but sultry enough to turn heads. "New dress?" I asked casually. "This old thing," she'd laughed, but I could see the price tag she'd tried to hide in the closet. $400 for a work dinner. When she kissed me goodbye, her lips barely grazed my cheek, the kind of perfunctory kiss you give when you're already mentally somewhere else. "Don't wait up," she'd said. "These things always run late when Marcus is involved. You know how creative types are." I didn't know how creative types were, actually, but I was starting to suspect I was about to find out. That evening, I spent doing what I do best, analyzing data. Not spreadsheets this time, but the data of my marriage. Sarah's recent behavior patterns spread out across my mind like a complex algorithm begging to be decoded. The late nights that had become more frequent, the way she'd started showering immediately after coming home from work, as if she needed to wash something off, the new lingerie I'd glimpsed in her drawer, lacy, expensive things that she definitely wasn't wearing for our Tuesday night routine. And then there were her phone habits. Sarah had always been glued to her device. It was part of her job, part of her generation. But lately, she'd become almost paranoid about it. Face down on tables, never left unattended, quick to flip it over if a notification came through while I was nearby. She'd started taking it into the bathroom when she showered, claiming she needed to stay connected for work emergencies. What kind of advertising emergency happens at 11 p.m. on a Saturday? By the time Sarah came home that night, at 2:17 a.m., according to the digital clock that glowed accusingly in our bedroom. I had already made a decision. I pretended to be asleep as she stumbled through our apartment, clearly having had more to drink than usual. She spent an unusually long time in the bathroom, and when she finally slipped into bed beside me, she smelled like expensive cologne that definitely wasn't mine. The next morning, Sarah was different. Lighter, somehow. Like she was floating on some secret that made her entire world more vibrant. She hummed while making coffee, something she hadn't done in months, and kept checking her phone with little smiles that she thought I couldn't see. "How was the dinner?" I asked over breakfast, keeping my tone casual while I studied her face. "Oh, the usual corporate nonsense," she said, but her eyes were bright with something that had nothing to do with quarterly reports. Marcus gave this amazing presentation about rebranding our client approach. Really innovative stuff. There was again, Marcus, the man who is apparently revolutionizing the advertising industry one company dinner at a time. "Sounds like he's quite the visionary," I said, taking a sip of my coffee. "Maybe I should finally meet him sometime. You could invite him over for dinner." Sarah's fork clattered against her plate, just for a second, but loud enough to break the morning quiet. "Oh, I don't think that's his kind of thing," she recovered quickly. "He's more of a nightlife person. Always bouncing between events and parties. Probably wouldn't be into our quiet domestic scene." Our quiet domestic scene. When had she started talking about our marriage like it was a consolation prize? That's when I knew. Not suspect, not worry, knew. My wife was having an affair with Marcus Hayes, and she thought she was smart enough to hide it from me. She thought her senior marketing director husband, the man who built his career on reading consumer behavior, on predicting patterns and identifying market gaps, wouldn't notice that she was treating him like just another client to be managed. But here's what Sarah didn't understand about me. What 6 years of marriage apparently hadn't taught her? I don't just notice patterns. I study them. I analyze them. Then I use them to build strategies that deliver results. The game had changed, and Sarah didn't even realize we were playing yet.
3 weeks later, the invitation arrived. Not for Sarah this time, but for me. Johnson & Associates' annual client appreciation dinner, read the elegant cardstock that had been hand-delivered to my office. "We would be honored by your presence as we celebrate another successful year of partnership with your company." Sarah's firm was one of our key marketing partners, which meant I had every legitimate reason to attend. What Sarah didn't know was that I'd been cultivating this invitation for weeks, leveraging my professional relationships and casually mentioning to our account director how much I'd love to see Sarah's work environment firsthand. When I told Sarah about the invitation that evening, her face went through a series of micro-expressions that would have been fascinating if they weren't so devastating. Surprise, panic, forced excitement, and finally, resignation. "Oh, that's wonderful," she said, but her voice pitched just slightly higher than normal. "I had no idea they were inviting client spouses. How thoughtful. I'm looking forward to finally meeting your colleagues, especially this Marcus you're always talking about. He sounds like quite the character." Sarah busied herself with straightening papers that were already perfectly aligned on our kitchen counter. "Yes, well, Marcus will definitely be there. He's very much the center of attention at these things." The night of the dinner, I dressed with the same strategic precision Sarah had shown weeks earlier. Navy suit, crisp white shirt, the Rolex she'd given me for our 5th anniversary. I looked like exactly what I was, a successful executive who belonged in rooms full of successful people. The venue was one of those trendy downtown spaces with exposed brick walls and Edison bulb lighting, the kind of place that photographed beautifully for social media. Sarah had suggested we arrive separately due to our different work schedules, but I could see the real reason the moment I walked in. She was already there, standing in a circle of colleagues, animated and glowing in a way I rarely saw at home anymore. And beside her, commanding the group's attention with expansive gestures and a confident smile, was Marcus Hayes. He was exactly what I had expected. Tall, dark-haired, with the kind of carefully cultivated stubble that suggested he spent more on grooming than most people spent on rent. Designer jeans paired with a blazer that probably cost more than Sarah's new dress, and shoes that gleamed under the ambient lighting. Everything about him screamed calculated casualness, the kind of effortless style that actually required enormous effort. But what struck me most was the way Sarah looked at him. Not the polite attention of a colleague, not even the admiring gaze of someone impressed by a superior. She was looking at him the way she used to look at me during our first year together, like he was the most fascinating person in any room. I approached their group slowly, taking time to observe the dynamics. Marcus was telling some story about a client presentation, using his hands to paint pictures in the air, and everyone was hanging on his every word. But there were subtle intimacies I doubt anyone else noticed. The way Sarah laughed just a beat longer than necessary, how she touched his arm when making a point, the shared glances that lasted just a fraction too long. "Sarah!" I called out, injecting just the right amount of pleasant surprise into my voice. She spun around, and for a moment, her face showed pure panic before she managed to rearrange it into a welcoming smile. "Jake, honey, you made it!" She came over and kissed my cheek, the same perfunctory kiss she'd been giving me for months, but I could feel the tension in her body. "Everyone, this is my husband, Jake Miller." The introductions went around the circle: account executives, junior creatives, the office manager, and then we reached Marcus. "And this is Marcus Hayes, our creative director. Marcus, meet Jake." He extended his hand with the kind of confident grip that suggested he was used to making strong first impressions. "Jake Miller," he said, and there was something in his tone, a subtle amusement, like he was enjoying a private joke. "Jake Miller," I said, matching his grip with equal firmness. "Funny. I've heard quite a bit about you, too." That's when it happened. Marcus's smile widened, and he tilted his head slightly, studying me with undisguised curiosity. "Really? That's, interesting." He glanced at Sarah, then back at me, and I could see the wheels turning in his head. "Tell me, Jake, how does it feel?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. The rest of the group had moved on to other conversations, but Marcus was staring at me intently, waiting for my response. Sarah had gone completely still beside me. "How does what feel?" I asked, though I began to understand exactly what he meant. Marcus's smirk deepened. "Oh, the whole work-life balance thing. Sarah's always talking about how demanding her job is, how much time she has to spend on, creative projects. Must be hard for a husband to compete with that kind of passion." The words hit like a physical blow, but I kept my expression neutral. He wasn't just talking about work projects, he was talking about their affair right in front of me, confident that I was too oblivious to understand. The arrogance was breathtaking. But instead of anger, I felt something else entirely, a cold, calculating clarity that I recognized from my most successful campaigns. Marcus Hayes had just made a crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the opponent. I let my own smile spread slowly across my face, not the polite smile of a clueless husband, but something sharper. "Marcus, that's a really interesting question. I guess it feels like being in the perfect position to observe, to really understand what's happening around me." Something flickered in his eyes. Uncertainty, maybe, or the first hint that this conversation wasn't going the way he'd expected. The thing about marketing is that it's all about reading your audience, understanding their motivations, their desires, their weaknesses, and then using that information strategically. Sarah's hand found my arm, her fingernails digging in slightly. "Jake, honey, maybe we should..." "Should what?" I turned to look at her, and I could see she recognized something in my expression that made her step back slightly. "Should mingle? Meet more of your colleagues?" I turned back to Marcus, whose smirk had faded considerably. "To answer your question directly, it feels like being exactly where I need to be." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced conversations and careful observations. I watched Sarah and Marcus navigate the party like dancers who'd rehearsed their steps, maintaining professional distance while their eyes found each other across the room with magnetic consistency. I saw the way she excused herself to the restroom, and he followed a few minutes later. I noticed how they both returned within moments of each other, Sarah's lipstick freshly applied and Marcus adjusting his blazer. By the time we said our goodbyes, I had everything I needed to confirm what I already knew. But more than that, I had something else. Marcus Hayes's measure. He was arrogant, careless, and he'd severely underestimated the man whose wife he was sleeping with. In the Uber home, Sarah was unusually quiet. "You seem to really hit it off with Marcus," she finally said, her voice carefully casual. "Did I?" I looked out the window at the city lights streaming past. "I found him educational." "What do you mean?" I turned to study her profile in the passing streetlight. "Just that some people reveal more about themselves than they realize. It's fascinating from a psychological perspective." Sarah didn't respond, but I could see her reflection in the window, and she looked like someone who was finally beginning to understand that the game she'd been playing had rules she didn't know about. The real education was just beginning.
The next morning, I woke up with the kind of clarity that comes from finally having a concrete objective. Sarah was already in the shower, another new habit, these dawn ablutions that happened before I was even awake. So I had a few minutes to establish my plan. In marketing, we have a saying, "Data tells stories, but only if you know how to read it." For the past 3 months, I'd been living with incomplete data, trying to make sense of behavioral patterns without understanding the underlying narrative. But after last night, after seeing Marcus Hayes's smug confidence and witnessing the electric tension between him and my wife, I finally knew what story the data was telling. Now, I just needed to prove it. My first advantage was something Sarah had never fully grasped. I understood technology in a way that went far beyond her casual user knowledge. 6 years of marriage meant I knew all her passwords, had access to our shared cloud storage, and understood her digital habits better than she did. She'd grown comfortable, careless even, assuming that her tech-challenged husband wouldn't know how to dig deeper than surface-level browsing history. She was wrong. I started with our phone records. As the account holder, I had access to detailed billing that showed call logs, text frequency, and data usage patterns. What I found was a masterclass in infidelity logistics, a sudden spike in texts to a number that wasn't saved in her contacts, calls that happened during her lunch breaks and immediately after work, data usage that suggested constant messaging app activity during times when she claimed to be in meetings. The number belonged to Marcus Hayes. Cross-referencing it with LinkedIn and a few other professional databases confirmed what I already knew, but seeing it laid out in black and white felt like being punched in the stomach all over again. But the phone records were just the beginning. Sarah's real mistake was assuming that deleting messages made them disappear. What she didn't understand was that our cloud backup system saved everything, and I knew exactly how to access those archived files. Late that night, while Sarah slept beside me with the satisfied exhaustion of someone living a double life, I sat in my home office and methodically reconstructed their entire relationship through recovered data. The messages painted a picture that was somehow worse than I had imagined. It wasn't just sex, though the explicit photos and videos they'd exchanged made that aspect abundantly clear. It was the emotional intimacy that cut deepest. Messages where Sarah complained about our boring marriage, where she called me predictable and safe, where Marcus encouraged her to think of their affair as liberation from domestic mediocrity. He's so focused on his spreadsheets and quarterly reports. Sometimes I feel like I'm married to a human calculator. You make me remember what it feels like to be actually alive. Marcus's responses were even more revealing. Some guys just don't know how to appreciate what they have. Lucky for me, right? They had pet names for each other, inside jokes. They had been planning weekend getaways while I worked late, thinking I was providing for our future. Sarah had even taken photos in our bedroom, our bed, to send to him, turning our most intimate space into a prop for her betrayal. But the most damaging evidence came from their carelessness in recent weeks. Screenshots of hotel confirmations, credit card receipts for expensive dinners I'd never heard about, location data that put them together during times when Sarah claimed to be at client meetings or working late. The paper trail was comprehensive, undeniable, and devastating. However, as I compiled this evidence, something interesting began to happen. The initial crushing pain of betrayal started transforming into something else entirely. Cold, analytical rage. This wasn't just about my wife cheating. This was about two people who thought they were smarter than me, who believed they could manipulate and deceive me without consequences. They'd underestimated Jake Miller, senior marketing director. But more than that, they'd underestimated Jake Miller, strategic thinker. I spent the next week in what I privately called deep research mode. Every spare moment was dedicated to understanding my opponents, because that's what they were now, opponents in a game they didn't even realize they were playing. Marcus Hayes' social media presence was a goldmine of useful information. Instagram posts revealed his haunts, his habits, his schedule. LinkedIn showed his professional connections and ambitions. Facebook, despite privacy settings, leaked enough information through mutual connections to paint a picture of someone who'd made similar conquests before. Sarah was just his latest project. But Marcus had a crucial weakness: arrogance. His social media was full of subtle boasts about his complicated personal life, cryptic posts about knowing what you want and taking it, and photos in locations I recognized from Sarah's recent work events. He was documenting his own affair, too self-satisfied to maintain proper operational security. Meanwhile, Sarah's digital footprint revealed someone desperately trying to maintain her perfect image while living a lie. Her Instagram posts about our relationship had become increasingly forced, like she was overcompensating. Recent photos of us together showed smiles that didn't reach their eyes, captions that felt scripted rather than heartfelt. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source: Marcus's ex-girlfriend, Kelly Chen, who I found through some careful social media archaeology. Kelly had been with Marcus for 2 years before their relationship ended 6 months ago, right around the time his involvement with Sarah began. Kelly's public posts were carefully neutral, but her private activity told a different story. She'd liked and commented on several articles about workplace affairs and emotional manipulation. She'd shared posts about recognizing narcissistic behavior and rebuilding after betrayal. Marcus Hayes had a pattern. I spent a weekend crafting a careful message to Kelly, reaching out through a professional networking context. I mentioned that I was researching workplace dynamics for a marketing campaign, and had come across her name in relation to Marcus's creative work. Would she be willing to share any insights about working with creative personalities? Her response came within hours, and it was more revealing than I dared hope. Marcus is talented, I'll give him that, but he has this need to conquer, you know? It's never enough to just be good at his job, he has to win at everything, especially if it means taking something from someone else. That's what gets him off. She went on to describe a pattern of behavior that sounded horrifyingly familiar. The intense pursuit, the secretive meetings, the way he'd made her feel special and chosen while systematically isolating her from other relationships. And then, once the conquest was complete, the gradual loss of interest and the inevitable search for his next target. The weird thing is, Kelly added, he never really wanted me for me, you know? He wanted me because I was dating someone else when we met. The challenge was more important than the person. Once he had me completely, I became just another girlfriend. Reading those words, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and pity. Vindication because it confirmed that Marcus was exactly the predator I'd suspected. Pity because Sarah had no idea she was just another conquest, another trophy in his collection of workplace victories. But Kelly's final message contains something even more valuable: intelligence about Marcus's methods and weaknesses. He's incredibly cocky, she wrote. Always thinks he's the smartest person in the room. That's what finally brought him down with me. He got so confident that he stopped being careful, started taking risks, making assumptions. If you're dealing with Marcus in any capacity, just remember, his ego is his biggest vulnerability. As I sat in my office that night, surrounded by printed emails, phone records, and carefully organized evidence, I realized I had everything I needed to destroy both of their lives completely. But simply exposing them felt too simple, too immediate. That would give them the opportunity to spin the narrative, to paint themselves as star-crossed lovers, or to blame me for being an inattentive husband. No. If Marcus's weakness was his ego, and Sarah's weakness was her need for social validation, then I needed to construct something more elegant, something that would use their own arrogance and carelessness against them. I needed to build a trap. And thanks to their own digital breadcrumbs and Marcus's predictable patterns, I knew exactly how to do it. The hunter was about to become the hunted.
The beauty of a well-executed marketing campaign is that the target never sees it coming. They think they're making independent choices, but every decision has been carefully guided by strategic positioning, emotional triggers, and perfectly timed revelations. What I was planning for Sarah and Marcus wasn't just revenge. It was the most important campaign of my career. My strategy had 3 phases: gathering, positioning, and execution. I had completed the gathering phase with devastating thoroughness. Now it was time to position my targets exactly where I needed them. The first step was establishing credible documentation. I contacted a private investigator recommended by my attorney, not because I needed more evidence, but because I needed evidence that would hold up in court. Professional surveillance photos, sworn affidavits, legally admissible digital forensics. If this was going to destroy their lives, it needed to be bulletproof. Detective James Morrison was a former police officer who specialized in corporate investigations. When I showed him what I'd already compiled, he whistled low and said, "Mr. Miller, you've basically done my job for me. This is the most organized case file I've ever seen from a client." "I believe in thorough preparation," I told him. "Well, your wife and her boyfriend are about to learn that lesson the hard way." Morrison's team spent 2 weeks conducting professional surveillance, and their findings confirmed everything I already knew while adding several details I'd missed. Marcus and Sarah had standing reservations at 3 different hotels. They'd been photographed entering and leaving together at least 12 times. Marcus was bragging about the affair to his close friends, apparently describing Sarah as his married conquest and me as completely clueless. The surveillance also revealed something else. Their pattern was becoming increasingly bold and careless. They were no longer bothering with elaborate cover stories or careful timing. Sarah would leave work with Marcus in full view of their colleagues, stay out until 2 a.m., and return home with barely constructed lies about client emergencies or creative brainstorming sessions. They thought they'd won. They thought I was too naive, too trusting, too buried in spreadsheets to notice what was happening right in front of me. That confidence was about to become their downfall. For the positioning phase, I needed to create a scenario where they would expose themselves completely while I controlled every variable. The opportunity came through Sarah herself in the form of another company event. "There's a big client presentation next Friday," she announced over dinner, barely looking up from her phone. "Marcus is unveiling this major campaign, and the whole team needs to be there for support. It'll probably run pretty late. You know how these things go." "Of course," I said, cutting my steak with surgical precision. "Big presentation, very important." "The client specifically requested an evening meeting," Sarah continued, her lies flowing as smoothly as expensive wine. "Something about accommodating their international schedule. Marcus thinks it could be a career-defining moment for everyone involved." I nodded sympathetically. "Well, you certainly can't miss a career-defining moment." What Sarah didn't know was that I'd already confirmed there was no client presentation scheduled for Friday night. I'd called Johnson & Associates directly, using a vendor inquiry as cover, and learned that their entire executive team would be at an industry conference in Chicago that week. Marcus and Sarah had fabricated the perfect cover story for what was clearly planned as an overnight rendezvous. They were probably planning to celebrate their cleverness, maybe even mock my gullibility over champagne and room service. Instead, they were about to walk directly into the most comprehensive documentation of infidelity in legal history. I spent the week making my own preparations, coordinating with Detective Morrison's team to ensure complete coverage of their presentation. Professional photographers with telephoto lenses, digital surveillance equipment, even a contact inside the hotel they'd chosen, the same upscale downtown property they'd used for 3 previous encounters. But the masterstroke of my positioning strategy was something more subtle. I'd arranged for their exposure to happen in front of an audience that would maximize the damage to both their careers and their social standing. Through careful research, I discovered that Marcus's ex-girlfriend Kelly worked at a PR firm that represented several of Johnson & Associates' competitors. A few strategic conversations had led to Kelly's firm being invited to a networking event at the same hotel where Marcus and Sarah planned to spend their romantic evening. I'd also learned that Sarah's college roommate Jessica had recently moved to the city and worked in social media management. A friendly Facebook message about getting together had resulted in Jessica being invited to the same networking event as Kelly's +1. Both women would be in the hotel lobby with cameras and social media accounts active just as Marcus and Sarah made their grand entrance for their fictional client meeting. The final element of my positioning strategy was personal. I would be there too. Friday evening arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made the city look like a movie set. Sarah spent 2 hours getting ready, choosing an outfit that was supposedly professional enough for a client presentation, but was clearly designed for seduction. Black dress, designer heels, jewelry I'd bought her for our last anniversary. "You look beautiful," I told her as she checked her reflection one final time. For just a moment she looked guilty, like she remembered that she used to care whether I found her beautiful. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the distracted energy of someone whose mind was already somewhere else. "Thanks," she said, kissing my cheek with practiced casualness. "Don't wait up. Marcus thinks this could go until midnight, especially if the client wants to discuss implementation strategies." Implementation strategies. Even her euphemisms had become elaborate. "I'll probably just work late myself. Big campaign deadline coming up." She was gone by 7, and I waited exactly 30 minutes before leaving for the hotel myself. Detective Morrison's team was already in position, and I'd reserved a corner table in the hotel bar that provided perfect sight lines to the lobby while keeping me concealed behind a decorative pillar. At 8:47 p.m., Marcus Hayes walked through the hotel's main entrance with the confidence of a man who believed he owned the world. He was dressed in dark jeans and a blazer, certainly not client presentation attire, and he moved through the lobby like he was starring in his own personal movie. Sarah arrived 12 minutes later, and the reunion was everything I had expected and worse. They embraced like lovers who had been separated for months, rather than colleagues who had seen each other that afternoon. Marcus spun her around, making her laugh with genuine joy I hadn't heard in months. They were completely oblivious to anything beyond their own bubble of infatuation. They were also completely oblivious to the 3 different photographers capturing every moment from multiple angles. As they moved toward the elevator, still wrapped around each other, I saw Kelly Chen enter the lobby with Jessica trailing behind. Both women stopped dead when they saw Marcus, and I watched Kelly's face transform from casual networking mode to something much sharper and more focused. She immediately pulled out her phone and started recording. From my position in the bar, I watched the elevator doors close on Marcus and Sarah, sealing their fate. In a few hours, they would come back down to a world that had fundamentally changed. Their secret would be secret no longer, documented and witnessed and ready to destroy everything they'd built their lives around. But the real trap hadn't even sprung yet. The real trap was waiting in my briefcase in the form of a carefully prepared presentation that would make Marcus Hayes' fictional client meeting look like amateur hour. Because while they were upstairs celebrating their cleverness, I was about to show them what a real strategic campaign looked like.
Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that makes everything seem possible. While Sarah slept off what she'd told me was exhaustion from the successful client presentation, I sat in my home office putting the finishing touches on what I privately called the Marcus Hayes account termination campaign. Sarah had stumbled home at 2:30 a.m., reeking of expensive cologne and hotel soap, spinning elaborate stories about client demands and last-minute strategy revisions. She'd been glowing with the satisfaction of someone who believed she had successfully deceived her husband yet again. She had no idea that her performance had been captured in 4K resolution from 6 different angles. The evidence Detective Morrison delivered that morning was more comprehensive than even I had anticipated. Professional photographs showed Marcus and Sarah entering the hotel, embracing in the lobby, going up in the elevator together, and emerging 4 hours later, disheveled and clearly intimate. Digital timestamps proved they'd been together during the exact hours Sarah claimed to be in a client presentation. But the real prize was the video Kelly Chen had taken and immediately posted to her Instagram story with the caption, "Well, well, well, looks like some people never change. #karma, #what goes around comes around." Kelly had over 3,000 followers, including dozens of people from the advertising industry. Marcus and Sarah's secret affair was now spreading through their professional network at viral speed. However, I wasn't ready to reveal my hand yet. I had one more card to play, and it required perfect timing. Monday morning, I arrived at my office early and made 3 phone calls that would reshape the landscape of Sarah and Marcus's professional lives.
The first was to David Chen, CEO of Jennison and Associates and Sarah's ultimate boss. The second was to Jennifer Walsh, Marcus's direct supervisor and the person responsible for client relationships at their firm. The third was to my own CEO, explaining why we needed to immediately review our advertising partnerships. By 10 a.m., I had meetings scheduled with all three executives for that afternoon. At lunch, I met with Detective Morrison to review our final presentation materials. "Mr. Miller," he said, organizing the evidence files, "I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone approach an infidelity case with this level of strategic planning. You've basically created a corporate takedown disguised as a personal matter. When someone betrays your trust, the response should be proportional to the damage they intended to cause. Well, the damage you're about to cause is going to be considerable." That afternoon, my meetings proceeded exactly as I'd anticipated. David Chen was horrified to learn that one of his account managers had been conducting a flagrant affair with a client vendor, creating potential legal and ethical liabilities for his company. Jennifer Walsh was equally disturbed to discover that her creative director had been sleeping with a married client contact, violating multiple company policies and professional standards. My own CEO was most concerned about the reputational risk of being associated with such unprofessional conduct, especially given the comprehensive documentation I provided. By 5 p.m., I had secured commitments from all three companies. Sarah would be terminated for ethical violations and breach of professional conduct. Marcus would face immediate dismissal and potential legal action for client relationship misconduct. And Jennison and Associates would be severing their contract with Marcus's firm, effective immediately. But I wasn't done yet. That evening, I prepared for the confrontation I'd been planning for weeks. Sarah arrived home at her usual time, slightly flushed and energetic in the way that had become familiar over the past months. She was humming again, that unconscious expression of satisfaction that came from believing she was successfully living a double life. "Good day at work?" I asked as she entered our living room, looking up from my laptop as she entered our living room. "Oh, the usual chaos," she said, settling onto the couch beside me with practiced casualness. "Marcus has been dealing with some difficult client feedback from Friday's presentation. It's been pretty stressful for everyone." I nodded sympathetically. "Client feedback can be brutal. I'm sure Marcus is handling it well, though. He seems like the type who's good under pressure." Sarah's smile was radiant. "He really is. He has this way of staying calm even when everything is falling apart around him." "Speaking of falling apart," I said, closing my laptop and turning to face her directly, "I have something I need to show you." I reached for the tablet I'd positioned on the coffee table and opened the photo gallery I'd prepared. The first image was a professional surveillance photo of Sarah and Marcus embracing in the hotel lobby, timestamp clearly visible in the corner. Sarah's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if they weren't so devastating: confusion, recognition, panic, and finally a desperate attempt to regain control. "Jake, I can explain." "Can you?" I swiped to the next photo, showing them entering the elevator together, because I'd love to hear how you explain being in the Meridian Hotel with Marcus Hayes during the same hours you claim to be in a client presentation. Sarah's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. I continued swiping through the gallery, exterior shots of them leaving together, interior security footage Morrison had obtained through legal channels, and even Kelly Chen's Instagram video playing on a loop. The thing about marketing, Sarah, is that it's all about controlling the narrative, presenting information in a way that leads your audience to the conclusion you want them to reach. I set the tablet down and looked directly into her eyes. "You've been running a marketing campaign against me for months, trying to sell me the story of a devoted wife who just happens to work late a lot. Jake, please, but here's what you didn't understand about your target audience. I'm not just any consumer. I'm a professional. I know how to research, I know how to analyze data, and I know how to build a counter campaign that completely destroys the original message. I picked up my phone and showed her the email confirmations I'd received that afternoon. Sarah Miller, terminated for ethical violations and breach of professional conduct. Marcus Hayes, dismissed immediately for client relationship misconduct. Jennison and Associates partnership severed due to unprofessional behavior. Sarah's face had gone completely white. You got us fired? I didn't get you fired, Sarah. You got yourself fired. I just documented it professionally. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city where both our careers had flourished until she decided to throw it all away. The beauty of thorough documentation is that it removes emotion from the equation. This isn't about revenge or jealousy. This is about consequences. You've ruined everything. Sarah's composure finally cracked completely. My career, my reputation. Your career? I turned back to face her, and for the first time in this entire conversation, I let some genuine emotion into my voice. Sarah, you've been systematically destroying our marriage for months while lying to my face every day. You've been taking photos in our bedroom to send to another man. You've been using money from our joint account to fund hotel rooms for your affair. You've been coming home from fucking Marcus Hayes and getting into bed with me like nothing happened. She flinched at the raw honesty, but I wasn't finished. So forgive me if I don't have much sympathy for your career concerns. You made your choices. You decided that Marcus Hayes was worth 6 years of marriage, worth more than the life we built together, worth more than basic human decency. Now you get to live with those choices. Sarah tried several more times to salvage the situation. Tears, apologies, promises that it was over, claims that she still loved me, but we both knew it was theater at this point. The marriage was over, had been over, since the first time she'd chosen Marcus over honesty. What happens now? She finally asked, her voice small and defeated. Now you pack your things and find somewhere else to stay. My attorney will be in touch about divorce proceedings. The prenup you insisted on 6 years ago, the one that protects your assets in case of infidelity, turns out to work both ways. Adultery with documented proof means you forfeit any claim to marital assets. The apartment, the cars, the investment accounts. All mine. And Marcus? I smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. Marcus is discovering that his reputation in this industry is smaller than he realized. Kelly Chen's Instagram post has been shared over 200 times in the past 3 days. Everyone in advertising knows what kind of person he is now. He'll find it difficult to get hired anywhere that values professionalism. As Sarah packed her belongings that night, moving through our apartment like a ghost of her former self, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, but relief. The elaborate deception was finally over. The careful management of appearances, the constant analysis of her behavior, the exhausting work of